Good afternoon, guys. This will be the wrap-up for your Chapter 35-36 lecture. For you guys, your review session again will be Sunday night, 7 p.m., so feel free to start posting questions as soon as I get that link up for you guys. And send any sort of email questions as well if you have any sort of problems over the weekend. Here we go.
At the White House in Washington, top defense officials of the nation gather to discuss the gravest world crisis since Poland and Pearl Harbor. The flagrant aggression of Chinese communist troops in Korea arouses the country's ire. With the North Korean bandits well under control and with the promise that UN troops would be withdrawn, the unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III. President Truman voices his accusation of Red imperialism.
The forces of the United Nations are in Korea to put down an aggression that threatens not only the whole fabric of the United Nations, but all human hopes of peace and justice. If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
On the battlefront in Korea, United Nations forces fight desperately to meet the Red attack. Here our troops must face what General MacArthur has termed a new war. Outnumbered more than 2-to-1 by Chinese and North Koreans, the UN forces hope to regroup and to meet the overwhelming attack which has broken their fluid lines of defense across northern Korea.
UN forces fought desperately to escape the Chinese onslaught. At the Chosin Reservoir, 6,000 Marines were encircled by the enemy. With temperatures dipping to minus 40 degrees below zero, their situation seemed hopeless. But in a heroic effort, dubbed the Chosin Breakout, their big guns and air support smashed the Chinese lines. 60,000 enemy troops were killed, and the Marines escaped. General MacArthur demanded that he be allowed to wage an all-out war against China. But President Truman was determined that Korea should remain a limited war. When MacArthur made it clear that he disagreed with that policy, the president fired him. By the spring of 1951, the war had degenerated into a brutal stalemate near the 38th parallel. American troops continued to fight and die in Korea for 2 long years. In the end, more than 4 million soldiers and civilians were killed during the conflict. Among them, 40,000 Americans died. For Harry Truman, the costly war in Korea was a crushing blow to his presidency. His popularity, already weakened by charges of losing China, collapsed. When the ceasefire agreement was finally signed in July 1953, it was Truman's successor, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who earned the credit.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments.
Korea is often called the Forgotten War, but it dramatically changed America's sense of security. For many, it reinforced the belief in monolithic communism, the assumption that all communist movements were orchestrated from Moscow.
If you'd like to stand out with your writing when it comes to the Cold War and communism, that term that they just ran through is key. Monolithic communism is the idea that develops inside of a lot of Americans of the idea that every communist is the same, whether it's Russian, Chinese, Cuban, North Korean, North Vietnamese, American, and it's going to be something that hamstrings our understanding, although it's going to be used as a really great tool when it comes to attacking people who are liberals, because as we saw, there's going to be people who will want to argue that anybody who is on the liberal side of the spectrum would be close to creeping communism or actually communism itself. The dilemma that we have, though, is for many of these communist countries, they're allied because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the first president to really understand that quite a bit is going to be Richard Nixon, who during his presidency is going to realize Russia and China have always had concerns with one another. You saw that when it came to like Manchuria in the early 1900s through the period right before World War II. And so what Nixon will start doing is instead of treating the communists as being monolithic, all one united group, he'll treat the Russians, the Chinese, the North Vietnamese, the Cubans as being different from one another. And as a result, he'll try to put pressure or wedges in between those countries so that we can divide their power rather than artificially uniting them behind the enemy of their enemy is their friend when it comes to the United States.
The idea poisoned American politics for decades and set the stage for the disaster in Vietnam. Korea also put the country on a permanent war footing, leading to spiraling defense spending and greatly increasing the Pentagon's influence. By the end of his term in 1960, President Eisenhower warned of a growing threat to the nation from within.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
As you hear Truman talking about, please find in your notes the section that you have titled America Begins to Rearm in Chapter 35, and you'll find what Eisenhower's talking about, because in 1947 we're going to create the National Security Act that creates the Department of Defense. It's going to replace the War Department. There's a feeling that having a Department of War during a period of the Cold War could be too provocative, so instead they name it the Department of the Defense to still keep doing the same things it did before. But we're now going to have a Secretary of Defense who is in the President's cabinet to give them advice, and we're also going to put together all the other heads of the military and bring together other members as what's known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so they can all provide advice to the President for what to do with the military. It's going to create a National Security Council also to advise the President on what to do with national security. We're going to create a CIA, which is going to replace our OSS, that is our spy agency. We're actually going to pay for a radio station that's going to start beaming radio broadcasts into communist countries to try to provide them with information about America and to hopefully stimulate democracy. We also put the draft back into place for kids who are 19 through 25. So if you saw Bye Bye Birdie and you saw the attempt to enlist Conrad Birdie in the draft, that's what's happening in 1957 when Elvis is going to be drafted, which is the inspiration for that play. Now, if you can take a look at the next section of your notes titled The Korean Volcano Erupts, there's a connection you should be noticing, and that's the creation of National Security Council Memorandum Number 68, which is advice that the President is getting as far as what he should be doing militarily to prepare for the Cold War. In NSC 68, the decision is made to quadruple defense spending, and Truman is going to massively build up our military, which is going to be taking up some 13% of our GDP. When we think about that military buildup, there's a couple elements I want to be considering. Number one, with Dwight D. Eisenhower, he is not going to be labeled a communist for getting involved in all sorts of defense spending, even though he is going to be creating a lot of military spending, which is similar to the stimulus that was created during World War II. So when we take a look at the boom economically we have in the 1950s, part of it is a World War II style inspired boom where we have all sorts of military spending taking place. Secondarily, you should notice that he is getting involved in both the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Interstate Highway Act, both of which are going to be gigantic works projects that will create stimulus for the American economy. This stimulus, though, is going to be done without any sort of controversy because with Eisenhower being a Republican, there is no accusation of him being a communist, although if it was FDR or Truman, that would have caused the accusations that they were involved in a communist plot. The other thing to keep in mind, though, with the interstate highway system is it's a gigantic military network. Eisenhower is going to try to figure out how to build what the Germans built with their Autobahn. And when we build the interstate highways, you should notice that it is essentially a gigantic military network to get military forces from one side of the country to the other. Eisenhower was part of a convoy around the time of World War I that tried to take troops from East Coast to West Coast, and it took them weeks to get across muddy roads that were not prepared for interstate travel. And if you've ever gone from one place in our country to another, like from Minneapolis up to Lake Mille Lacs, you'll find that our highways go like 55 miles per hour, then slow down for each town going 30. And so the idea with our interstate is it's going to be a highway system that does not have any traffic lights on it, so you never slow down. If you come to a city, you'll bypass them by going around it. So notice with our interstate, we have 94 that comes in the cities, and it turns into 494 that goes south, 694 that goes north, 394 that runs through the middle, and all of those highways, none of them are going to slow down. You'll also notice with our interstate highway systems, they're numbered. So if you're going north and south, you're going to be going on an odd number highway, like Highway 35. East-west is going to be 94 in our state, so even numbers go east and west. And two other facets you should notice with our highway system, you'll notice that out in the country, they have very flat, straight sort of places that have no power lines going over the top of them. Those places are meant to be our runways. If there's ever a nuclear bomb that blows up our airports, we can then land planes on those highways out in the middle of our countrysides. And then secondarily, whenever you drive on our interstates, notice that when you go under a bridge, you can have semi-trucks get under them easily because the overpasses are built so that a flatbed trailer with a tank on the back could still work its way underneath those overpasses, and we could then get our troops from the East Coast to the West Coast to deal with a Russian invasion without having any sort of problem. Our issue, though, what that Eisenhower is trying to share with us, so we've got now these works projects, we've got these military builds up where we're spending tons of money. Notice Eisenhower's farewell address, where he announces in his farewell address that we need to be worried about military contractors, what he calls the military-industrial complex. Now, being a general who is not going to be called a communist by anybody who is being reasonable, he comes out and says that we need to be very worried about the fact that for the American people, they are going to be very much feeling pressure inside the government from military contractors to provide money for our weapon systems. And what he's trying to say is that we are now seeing pressure happening in a huge amount to buy brand new weapon systems. These contractors are having huge amounts of influence on the politicians. In a previous generation, they might have been referred to as the merchants of death. But what Eisenhower is saying is that these guys, as they get more powerful, the only time we'll need to buy new weapons is by getting into new wars. And so Eisenhower is warning that if these guys become really influential, they could push us into wars in the future that aren't necessarily for America's interest, but it might make them more money by being able to sell more weapons. And so this warning is something that's very lasting from Eisenhower, where for many Americans they feel that that was a very appropriate sort of warning given the military buildup that we've witnessed over the past few decades.
Attention, attention. This is an official civil defense warning. This is not a test. The United States is under nuclear attack. Take cover immediately in your area fallout shelter. Repeat, the United States is under nuclear attack.
America's Cold War years were filled with fear. Daily radio and newspaper reports blared frightening stories of advancing communism, imminent nuclear war, and Soviet spies. America responded with an all-out offensive against communist infiltration.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
The guy that you saw was J. Edgar Hoover. He's a famous man that needs to go into your notes, although he's understated inside your textbook. He'll be ever present throughout your entire text up until the 1970s. So let me give you the background of J. Edgar Hoover. He was a guy who was originally tracking down gangsters during Prohibition. Then during the period of World War II, he's involved in our security agency that we have here in America, and he's famous for going to FDR and trying to tell him that internment camps are not necessary because of the fact that we already have a feel for who the Japanese spies might be in our country. And if there are Japanese spies, their physical appearance is going to give them away so that there is no need to lock up all of the Japanese citizens on the West Coast. But like you learned, FDR is going to ignore him for that. His most famous elements, though, is going to be being the head of the FBI. And J. Edgar Hoover is a very controversial figure, largely because of the fact that there are going to be scandals that you'll be learning about in our class, and they'll become more and more important as we move forward. We're watching a scandal right now concerning our president and his sexual behavior that is playing out in the news currently. And for our class, it's less concerning about whether or not the president does something like that, and if he did or didn't. It's less about the sexuality or the morality of it. Instead, what we're really concerned about in a situation like that is the potential for blackmail, where if somebody gets information about the president for engaging in behavior that's embarrassing, and there's a cover-up that takes place, then there's a potential that the president could be blackmailed by somebody who gets that information and then could force the president to do things that aren't for the country's interest, but just to protect their well-being. For J. Edgar Hoover, famously, JFK planned on doing stuff against J. Edgar Hoover for removing him from the FBI. And supposedly J. Edgar Hoover went to Kennedy and pointed out that he had evidence that Kennedy was involved in having affairs on the side. And amazingly, then J. Edgar Hoover did not get fired. So he had leverage over presidents because of the embarrassing information that he had in his possession. In this case, though, with J. Edgar Hoover, this is the start of his rise to immense amounts of power, because he becomes an attacker of communists inside the country. And what he's saying in this speech is that while communism had been a political party previously, and it's still around nowadays, his argument during the 1940s and 50s is we don't have the luxury of treating it as a party. We need to treat these people as spies. So let me give you some pieces of evidence to work backwards with. What you're about to see is similar to the Alien and Sedition Acts during the Adams presidency, when we were worried about French spies inside the United States. It's also similar to Woodrow Wilson's time period of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, where we are going to give the president power to root out radicalism inside of our country. And in this case, we're going to see the rise of two groups, the HUAC and the McCarthy hearings, both of which are meant to try to track down communists inside of our country. In both of these hearings, though, they're going to turn into kangaroo courts, because you should remember with checks and balances, it's the role of the Congress to create laws, but they're going to take it on themselves to be the enforcer of laws, and they're going to hold trials, which aren't technically trials. So the people put on trial are going to be not afforded the rights they have in the Bill of Rights of being able to have the Eighth Amendment and other amendments of due process and whatever, and that's going to be used against them. Now, if you read the book by Arthur Miller, The Crucible, in your English class, that's going to be the main focus of that book, is the feeling that there's a similarity between this and the Puritans who got involved in their witch hunts. And there's a desire inside of our country during this time period to not be different. So this group right here is encouraging conformity, where if you are a communist or you're leaning that direction, there's going to be pressure put on you to not just stop being a communist, but to rat out others. And there's going to be an effort to try to embarrass or shame or destroy the careers of some individuals who are seen as resisting that, even though they might see themselves as protecting civil liberties.
While Hoover's FBI worked behind the scenes, Congress expanded its own high-profile investigations, often ignoring the civil rights of the accused.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Beginning in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, investigated communist influence in Hollywood. The committee was concerned with the power of movies to persuade audiences with subversive messages. With movie stars and other industry professionals called to testify, the hearings became red carpet events. For the anti-communist witch hunt, it was a publicity bonanza.
It is completely against the un-American feeling, this communistic thing. I believe I would move to the state of Texas if it ever came here, because I think the Texans would kill them on sight.
We have sold them some films a good many years ago. They bought the Three Little Pigs and used it through Russia.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
Most witnesses cooperated with the committee. However, a small group who became known as the Hollywood 10 refused to answer questions, citing protection under the First Amendment. Among them, screenwriter John Howard Lawson.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
then
answer
you denied,
to a question
then
which
you,
invades his, absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I
stand away from the stand.
For the Bill of Rights,
stand away from the stand. Therefore, it is the unanimous opinion of this subcommittee, John Howard Lawson is in contempt of Congress.
The Hollywood 10 were convicted of contempt and sent to prison. Thousands of others were blacklisted by the studios, forcing many talented movie makers into exile and obscurity. Among the friendly witnesses who testified in 1947 was a B-movie actor named Ronald Reagan. No one could have suspected that 4 decades later, Reagan would play a leading role in bringing the Cold War to an end.
So the decision was made during this time period to organize the HUAC in a different way. The HUAC had originally been created during World War II to try to root out fascists who are inside the country. But what you should be paying attention to is this is a House committee, so they're allowed to gather information about bills that they're creating. And as a result, you can't plead the fifth. You can't have a lawyer present and counseling you because the questions aren't supposed to turn into a prosecution. But instead, this will be turned into a kangaroo court where they're bringing people in and interrogating them. And even if they're not found guilty of a crime, they're on national TV and they can be embarrassed pretty heavily. They can also be held in contempt of court. So if they don't answer the questions the way that they're asked, they can be thrown in jail. And you saw them just getting blacklisted. Now, the reason why they're very worried about this is, especially with Hollywood, there's a feeling that the liberalism in Hollywood is dangerous, especially since it's been liberal back then, it's liberal nowadays. And during that time period in movies, they're playing around with subliminal messaging, where they're trying to slip images or messages into movies to try to brainwash people to go out into the concession area and buy popcorn or other sorts of things. There's a fear that if they're allowed to do that in movies that way, why can't they also brainwash kids into being communist? So you'll see a wave of things happening inside 1947 and beyond, where they create like loyalty oath programs for people who are inside the government, or else in other sorts of businesses that are seen as influential, whether it's teachers at both the middle school, high school, collegiate level, or in ministry or whatever. And so there'll be a push to try to root out any sort of radicalism that could be used to brainwash people into becoming communists. There is the use of the Smith Act, which is going to be an anti-sedition law that is going to be used to throw in jail a number of communists. And in the Supreme Court case, Dennis versus the United States, that is upheld. But when we think about the HUAC, this HUAC is going to be very much going after Hollywood. And the main figure that you want to notice is Richard Nixon, because his political career is going to be based on his behavior here. He is somebody who is going to be looking for communists inside of Hollywood, and instead of finding them in Hollywood, he'll find them with a guy named Alger Hiss. His name's important, because with Alger Hiss, he is initially going to be seen as a riser inside the Democratic Party. And then what he's accused of is he's accused of helping out the communists in the 1930s. When he is accused by a guy named Whittaker Chambers, Hiss denies his being involved in communism. But then when Whittaker Chambers can bring out a piece of microfilm that he's been storing inside of a hollowed-out pumpkin to prove that Hiss was smuggling out information for the communists, this now is the thing that sets off your Red Scare in a huge way, because it's now not seen as kind of a fringe sort of deal. There's a guy in the State Department who is influential, who is somebody who has a career in front of him, and there's a feeling that if he's infiltrated, then there could be danger going on. When you see then the Rosenbergs get found out that they have been helping to smuggle nuclear secrets to the Russians, that then makes it even worse. And so once you find people inside the government who are suspected and proven of wrongdoing, that is then going to accelerate the hunt for communists inside of our government.
If communists have attempted to inject their propaganda into the motion picture, they have failed miserably.
Perhaps Hollywood wasn't influenced by communists, but it was affected by the hearings. Movie studios added to the hysteria by cranking out such anti-communist films as Is This Tomorrow?, Red Planet Mars, and dozens of others. But tawdry films did little to distract President Truman from what he saw as a perversion of American democracy.
Now I'm going to tell you how we're not going to fight communism. We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret police. We're not going to try to control what our people read and say and think. We're not going to turn the United States into a right-wing totalitarian country in order to deal with a left-wing totalitarian threat. In short, we're not going to end democracy. We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books.
Against the president's objections, Congress passed more dubious legislation, including the Internal Security Bill of 1950, which empowered the government to take action against anyone it deemed a security risk. Truman called it the greatest danger to freedom of speech, press, and assembly since the Alien and Sedition Laws of 1798. In 1948, the Red Hunt struck at the very center of government when ex-communist Whittaker Chambers accused a former State Department employee named Alger Hiss of spying for the Soviet Union.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting and I am fighting.
The House committee was prepared to dismiss the case for lack of conclusive evidence, but one of its members pressed the issue, an ambitious young congressman from California, Richard Nixon.
These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing that these documents were sent to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union happened to be in conflict with those of the United States.
Alger Hiss was convicted, not of treason, but of perjury, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His supporters said he was a victim of the communist hysteria. Others saw him as part of a communist conspiracy to destroy the United States and press the search for more traitors. Within months, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested in connection with a plot to pass U.S. bomb secrets to the Soviets. The Rosenbergs denied the charges and claimed they were being persecuted as Jews and for their left-wing views. The evidence suggested they played a small but material role in the spy ring. The Rosenbergs were convicted and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Protests erupted amid claims of anti-Semitism. The Nobel Prize-winning writer Jean-Paul Sartre condemned the sentence as a legal lynching which smears with blood a whole nation. He warned,
"Your country is sick with fear. You are afraid of the shadow of your own bomb."
Despite the outcry, the Rosenbergs were executed in 1953.
Union Square in New York was the backdrop for these scenes of red violence. From their ranks will come the saboteurs, spies, and subversives should World War III be forced upon America.
At the height of the anti-communist hysteria, the real danger to America came not from the Reds, but from the so-called Red Baiters.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
Of all the demagogues who exploited the Red Scare for political gain, no one matched the senator from Wisconsin, whose namesake, McCarthyism, would come to define the entire era of political persecution. Senator Joseph McCarthy emerged from virtual obscurity in 1950 when he claimed he had a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. The claim was patently untrue, but it launched McCarthy on a political juggernaut. For 4 years, the senator ran roughshod over civil liberties, while the news media served as a conduit for his reckless, unsubstantiated charges.
He had been a member of the party that he had recommended.
McCarthy's audacity knew no bounds. He accused Secretary of State George Marshall, the architect of the Marshall Plan, of infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. He threatened President Truman and suggested the Democratic Party was a bedfellow of international communism. The hysteria of McCarthyism seeped into every aspect of American life. People rushed to condemn friends, neighbors, and co-workers. Many were fired or shunned for perceived left leanings. Though McCarthy wore a cloak of patriotism, his abusive actions had a chilling effect on democracy. He was told,
"You have created an atmosphere so vile that people have lost confidence in their government."
But slowly, the tide began to turn. Dissenters spoke out.
McCarthy to air new case of known red in Army.
The respected journalist Edward R. Murrow attacked McCarthy's repugnant tactics on his investigative TV series, See It Now.
1 month ago tonight, we presented a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. We labeled it as controversial.
McCarthy remained characteristically defiant.
If I am giving comfort to our enemies, I ought not to be in the Senate. If, on the other hand, Mr. Murrow is giving comfort to our enemies, he ought not to be brought into the homes of millions of Americans by the Columbia Broadcasting System.
So the pertinence of Joseph McCarthy is that he was somebody who was trying to figure out an issue that would be his hook for his campaign. And when he was at a party, there was a discussion, and many people at the party pointed out to him, nobody likes communists. And so that's when he became the communist attack dog. When you look at Joseph McCarthy, there is undeniably communism that is happening inside the country. There is espionage. The reason why Joseph McCarthy gets the reputation that he does is because of a couple different things. Number one, he's going to be lying pretty regularly and making really radical accusations against a whole bunch of people. So when he first stands up and he says, "I've got a packet full of stuff that tells me about 200 people in the State Department that are known communists," that packet didn't have anything in it like that. And when he was asked for it in the future, he just moved on to other sorts of smears and accusations that were also wild against people. And the problem with McCarthyism was whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, if you fought back against McCarthy, you were in danger of being labeled a communist yourself. So this is kind of like what we see in the books of the Crucible and the Scarlet Letter and any sort of other comparisons back to the puritanical times. The Scarlet Letter, obviously, mid-1800s, but it's that same sort of tenor of intolerance that you see inside that Puritan community, where back in the old days, if you were accused of being a witch, the safest way to avoid getting burned at the stake or being crushed or being hanged was to announce you were a witch and ask for forgiveness. The easiest way to get executed as a witch was either to say you're not a witch, or else to argue that the witch trials were being slanted, which was usually what they would say is what a witch would use as a tactic. And so we're going to see the same thing happen in the communist attacks, where if you went after McCarthy, he would then label you as being a potential communist. So it was really hard to slow down his demagoguery when he got into it. You also saw the role of the media, and so right now we're in a battle about whether or not the media needs to be preserved and protected, because you saw Edward R. Murrow, who presented a fact-based piece talking about the different ways that Joseph McCarthy was lying about the spread of communism inside the country. And you'll notice Joseph McCarthy's response. His response was, if I've done anything bad, I should be kicked out. And he invited criticism, but also with the idea that if you criticized him, he would turn on you and call you a communist. But then he finished by making the unfounded allegation that Edward R. Murrow was offering aid and comfort to communists inside of our country, and labeling Murrow as a communist and labeling what he was talking about as lies, or in today's vernacular, fake news, was what was dangerous, because essentially if McCarthy didn't like what somebody was saying, he would label them as an enemy of the state, label their truths as being lies, and then he was able to keep going with his investigations. Now, the thing that's going to derail McCarthy, who is involved in an investigation that is similar to the HUAC, is he's going to make the decision once he starts running out of enemies that he wants to attack the military. So you're going to see in the next segment he attacks the Army, and that's where Eisenhower is going to finally be fed up with McCarthy. While they're on the same side of the spectrum, Eisenhower was nervous about how far McCarthy was going, and when McCarthy makes the claim that the Army is filled with communists, which was the organization that Eisenhower used to run, that's when Eisenhower is going to have enough and put pressure on McCarthy to go. But by that point, McCarthy has really stoked the flames of people inside of our country. So they're on a witch hunt. They are suspecting every teacher, every press person, every person in the government, every person who's in a position of authority of being a communist. And it does a huge amount of damage to the trusted institutions that we have during that time.
With his support withering, McCarthy pitted himself against the U.S. Army in an investigation of charges and countercharges concerning clout, favoritism, and communist cover-ups.
Unless we make sure that there is no infiltration of our government, then just as certain as you sit there, you will see a red world.
The ensuing Army-McCarthy hearings tore away the senator's mask of self-righteousness and struck a fatal blow to his crusade.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness.
The hearings were a media circus, and in the end, inconclusive. But for the tens of millions of viewers who tuned in to watch, McCarthy was revealed to be an arrogant, blustering tyrant.
The American people have had a look at you for 6 weeks. You're not fooling anyone either.
The American public had seen enough. Nearly overnight, McCarthy's immense national popularity evaporated. President Eisenhower probably spoke for millions of Americans when he said,
"It's no longer McCarthyism, it's McCarthyism."
Ooh, dang, sing! Look at Eisenhower!
3 years later, Joseph McCarthy died, probably of complications from alcoholism. He was 48 years old. McCarthy faded, but an unsettling question remained. Could America win the Cold War without sacrificing the very liberties it was fighting to safeguard? Ominously, a highly classified government report concluded, "It is now clear we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply." A new and frightening day was dawning, one in which legal and moral restraints were set aside in a high-stakes game of diplomatic maneuvering, clandestine operations, and nuclear brinksmanship. Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin led their nations from World War victory in 1945 through 7 years of tense confrontation. By 1953, it was time for a new generation of cold warriors to take command. In Washington, the changing of the guard came democratically.
The people speak, and their verdict, a landslide victory for Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected president with the greatest popular vote ever given a White House candidate.
The hero of D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, became the first Republican president in 20 years. On the campaign trail, Eisenhower pledged to take a hard line with the Soviet Union and to bring an end to the war in Korea.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world.
As president, Eisenhower continued the policy of containment, but his administration's new look defense strategy relied more heavily on air power and nuclear weapons. Deploying an effective nuclear arsenal was easier and cheaper than maintaining a massive land army. Eisenhower could defend the nation, cut taxes, and curb inflation, all at the same time. In the expression of the day, it was a bigger bang for the buck. The new look was not just economical, it was aggressive. The White House adopted a policy of massive retaliation to deter Soviet aggression. It stated that if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, the U.S. would respond by launching more than 3,000 nuclear missiles against every major urban, industrial, and military target throughout the communist world. Experts estimated that such an attack would kill 285 million people. President Eisenhower refused to consider options that stopped short of total war. But even as the Eisenhower White House was refining its Cold War strategy, news from Moscow that Joseph Stalin had died dramatically altered the playing field. The official cause was a stroke, but many suspected poison. Without a plan for succession, a collective leadership assumed control of the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, they extended an olive branch to the west. Speaking for the party, Georgy Malenkov declared, "We stand as we have always stood, for peaceful coexistence of the two systems." Coming from the avowed enemy of capitalism, peaceful coexistence was a radical notion. Was this just Soviet propaganda, or was the new Kremlin really different than the old? In an address dubbed Chance for Peace, Eisenhower called on the Soviets to demonstrate they had truly broken with Stalin's legacy.
I know of only one question upon which progress waits. It is this: what is the Soviet Union ready to do? Whatever the answer is, let it be plainly spoken. Again we say the hunger for peace is too great, the hour in history too late for any government to mock men's hopes with mere words and promises and gestures.
Before the Soviets could respond, the president's seemingly genuine offer was contradicted by his own Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. He ridiculed the idea of peaceful coexistence as a ploy to divide the Western Allies, adding, "We are not dancing to any Russian tune." The chance for peace, if it ever existed, was squandered, and U.S.-Soviet relations continued to vacillate between measured tolerance and outright disdain. 2 years later, in 1955, both nations were seeking opportunities to relax Cold War tensions. They met face-to-face in Geneva, Switzerland, for the first time since the end of World War II.
Some 11 years ago, I came to Europe with an army, a navy, an air force, with a single purpose: to destroy Nazism. This time, I come armed with something far more powerful: the goodwill of America, the great hopes of America, the aspirations of America for peace.
Americans got their first good look at the new Kremlin powers at the summit. There was Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin, Defense Minister Marshal Zhukov, and the outspoken head of the Soviet Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev. During discussions, Eisenhower suggested a program he called Open Skies that would permit air reconnaissance over both countries. Bulganin and Zhukov were receptive to the idea, but Khrushchev quickly denounced the idea as a bold espionage plot. After 2 years of uncertainty, it was clear that Nikita Khrushchev was now the top man in Moscow. Khrushchev's reason for refusing Open Skies was simple. His nation had been threatening the West with nuclear rockets it simply did not have, and bombs it could not deliver onto American soil. These military shortcomings were a closely held secret in the Kremlin, but they would not remain secret for long. On July 4th, 1957, a Lockheed U-2 spy plane made its inaugural flight over the Soviet Union. From an altitude of 70,000 feet, the U-2 captured stunningly clear images of its target. For 4 years, U-2 flights gathered revealing intelligence about Soviet military installations and missile deployments. But President Eisenhower feared the inevitable. Sooner or later, he said, one of these things is going to get shot down. Nikita Khrushchev was an entirely new kind of Soviet leader. He was not evil like Joseph Stalin, but in his relations with the West, he was openly defiant and often belligerent. He boasted of the Soviet Union's vastly superior nuclear capabilities that could wipe out any American or European city. True or not, Khrushchev's threats to unleash his rocket weapons on Western targets was unnerving. But for all his nuclear posturing, Khrushchev could be amiable, and at times even likable. In 1959, he engaged Vice President Richard Nixon in an impromptu debate over the relative merits of capitalism and communism.
Teach us some things, and it will teach you some things too. Because after all, you don't know everything.
That every word that you have said here will be reported in the United States, and they will see you say it on television.
Khrushchev would soon have a chance to witness a capitalist democracy firsthand.
The President of the United States has invited Mr. Nikita Khrushchev, Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, to pay an official visit to the United States in September.
Khrushchev was the first Soviet head of state ever to visit the United States. During his stay, he was exposed to the extremes of American life and culture, from movie stars in Hollywood to farm production in the American heartland.
Nikita Khrushchev's American tour swings into the world's best corn country. At one of the world's most modern, efficient, and profitable farming operations, Khrushchev shows an enthusiasm springing from his Ukrainian peasant background and the interest of a leader whose nation has long known major food production problems.
The Soviet leader acknowledged the riches of the United States, but boasted, "Tomorrow we shall be as rich as you are." The next day, even richer. Meetings with President Eisenhower failed to break new ground, but the two leaders bridged a divide. They pledged to meet again in Paris the following year. Khrushchev was deeply moved by his American experience.
Хорошим американским словом. Окей? Хорошо. До свидания, друзья.
I hope that in the relationships between our two countries, we will be able to use more and more often the good short American word, okay, until we meet again, friends.
Upon returning to Moscow, he openly declared, "Long live Soviet-American friendship," pledging his nation to massive cuts in its conventional military as a first step towards peace. By this time, the U-2 had revealed that the Soviets were greatly exaggerating their nuclear capabilities. Seeing continued surveillance as a diplomatic risk, Eisenhower had suspended the flights. But under pressure from his advisors, he reluctantly agreed to allow one more mission.
May Day in Moscow. This year's parade through Red Square is a 3.5-hour affair with emphasis on peaceful coexistence.
On May 1st, 1960, as Kremlin leaders waved to the May Day crowds in Red Square, a U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet airspace. In an instant, the plane, the pilot, and any chance for peaceful coexistence came crashing to Earth. The White House had devised a cover plan for just such an occurrence. They claimed the U-2 was on a weather mission originating in Turkey for NASA and had strayed off course. The next day, they changed the story. The plane was piloted by a civilian, and the failure in oxygen equipment had resulted in the pilot losing consciousness and accidentally violating Soviet airspace. It was all rubbish. Khrushchev knew the U.S. had been flying spy missions over the Soviet Union, and now he had the evidence to prove it. the wreckage of the U-2, and the American pilot, alive and kicking. Trapped, Eisenhower finally came clean with the American public.
Now, this does not put the United States on trial whatsoever.
At the Paris summit 2 weeks later, Khrushchev turned the U-2 incident into a crisis.
Khrushchev outdoes his earlier outburst against President Eisenhower at the commencement of the Paris meeting. Flanked by Foreign Minister Gromyko and glowering Marshal Malinowski, he fires a barrage of threats, insults, and menaces, warns of devastating blows at bases used by American espionage planes, denounces American acts of aggression, and in general follows a tough line that seems to signal a new freezing spell in the Cold War.
The captured U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was convicted of espionage against the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was August 17, 1960. That very same day, in the skies over the Pacific Ocean, an Air Force pilot snatched a falling capsule from midair. The event marked a breakthrough in the top-secret project to develop Corona, the world's first Earth-orbiting reconnaissance satellite. The U-2 may have been downed, but America had a new eye in the sky, and this one could capture stunningly clear and revealing images of its target from more than 100 miles in outer space. Joseph Stalin made the dark cloud hanging over the Cold War infinitely more sinister. His crimes against his own people were so great as to be immeasurable. 1 million, 10 million, perhaps 40 million Soviet citizens perished during his reign of terror. His was a government run by fear, cruelty, and finally, madness. But in March 1953, the monster met his end, and leadership of the Soviet Union passed to a collective of top Kremlin officials. They sought to distance themselves from Stalin's cruel legacy, but they soon realized that fear and intimidation were the only things keeping them in power. The first test of their authority came almost instantly. In East Germany, Walter Ulbricht ran his government according to the cold-blooded dictates of Stalinism. No one dared challenge his authority for fear of imprisonment or death. Stalin himself boasted that a revolt by the East German people was impossible. Revolt? Why, they won't even cross the street unless the light is green. But in June 1953, they stormed the streets in waves of anti-government protest. The violence quickly spread to cities across East Germany. With Ulbricht's government in peril, Moscow ordered Soviet forces to intervene and put an end to the demonstrations. Hundreds were killed or later executed. The events of the 1953 East German uprising are recounted in a poem by the German poet Bertolt Brecht. After the uprising of the 17 June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalinie, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier, in that case, for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? In the United States, the new administration had not anticipated the challenge to Soviet authority. Despite his campaign pledge to roll back communism and free the enslaved people of Eastern Europe, President Eisenhower refused to intervene. In the wake of the East German uprising, the top ranks of the Kremlin were reshuffled. When the bloodletting was over, a single man stood at the pinnacle of Soviet government: Nikita Khrushchev. With power consolidated in the Kremlin, the Soviet Union and the Cold War took a dramatic turn. In 1956, Khrushchev rocked the communist world to its core by tearing down the legacy of Stalin himself. Before the 20th Communist Party Congress, he unleashed a fiery 4-hour condemnation of the late Soviet leader and his cult of personality. Stalin abandoned the method of ideological struggle for that of administrative violence, mass repressions, and terror. He possessed a capricious and despotic character, and he was a supreme egotist and sadist, capable of sacrificing anything and anybody for his own power and glory. The impact of the secret speech was immense. It ushered in a period of relative liberalization known as Khrushchev's thaw. By Western standards, the changes were modest. But to the long-suffering people of Eastern Europe, enraged by 10 years of Soviet-style repression, they were cause for revolution. Just months after the secret speech, an uprising by Polish workers challenged Khrushchev to make good on his promises for reform. In its aftermath, Vice President Richard Nixon noted cynically, it would serve American interests if the Soviets pounded another upstart satellite, such as Hungary, into submission. He got his wish in October of 1956. In the Hungarian capital of Budapest, students and workers demonstrated against the repressive policies of the country's Stalinist government. They demanded an end to the Soviet military occupation, free elections, and the return to power of their deposed prime minister, Imre Nagy. But events quickly spiraled out of control. The Hungarian secret police opened fire on a crowd of demonstrators. But that only fueled the rioting. Symbols of Soviet enslavement were destroyed. Hungarian resistance fighters, or partisans, hunted down and killed government officials. By the next day, Soviet forces had entered the fray, and the city was at war. The partisans fought Soviet tanks using Molotov cocktails and small arms. The American-sponsored Radio Free Europe encouraged the rebels to fight the Soviets to the death. Finally, after nearly a week of violence, an uneasy ceasefire descended on the city. Soviet tanks were withdrawn. Negotiations were commenced to seat a new government in Budapest, independent of Moscow's influence. Against impossible odds, it appeared the heroic freedom fighters had prevailed against the mighty Soviet Union.
At the end of a 6-day fight that astonished the world and shook the Kremlin to its foundations, Hungary was free to fraternize on its own borders and rush in supplies to the stricken city of Budapest along roads littered with burnt-out red tanks, disabled by almost unarmed men fired by passion for liberty. Flaring swiftly from student demonstrations into open revolution, the pent-up hatreds of oppression sent Russian might reeling and forced withdrawal of the red yoke. But even as these scenes were recorded, rumors flared of the re-entry of Russian forces and new fighting. The beautiful city of Budapest, scarred by conflict, again faces a Russian onslaught, even before the debris of the fight for freedom is cleared from the streets.
The world watched and waited, even as tens of thousands of desperate refugees fled for their lives. Khrushchev agonized over what to do next. could he allow Hungary to determine its own political future? That would mean losing face and perhaps losing the rest of Eastern Europe. In the end, it was too much to concede. On November 4th, Soviet military forces rolled into Hungary with orders to terminate the rebellion. A radio transmission captured the final desperate moments of Hungarian freedom.
We are under heavy machine gun fire. We will hold out till the last drop of blood. Goodbye, friends. God save our souls. The Russians are too near.
In America, the man who promised to roll back communism provided no military support. No diplomatic intervention. Nothing. Budapest lay in ruins. Several thousand were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Imre Nagy was arrested by Soviet forces, imprisoned, and executed. Khrushchev said it would serve as a lesson to all other leaders in socialist countries.
The Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus.
In 1956, the Soviet Union wasn't the only country fighting to hold on to its satellites. While Russian tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising, Britain and France invaded Egypt in a display of colonial arrogance and brutal desperation. Their attack was aimed at regaining control of the Suez Canal, the strategic link between the oil-rich Middle East and Western Europe, which had been controlled by an Anglo-French alliance for nearly a century. The incursion ended in humiliation for the invaders. It was a sign of the times for the once great colonial empires. During the decades following World War II, dozens of colonies defied colonial rule by declaring their independence. Each had to choose a method of government, and most faced severe economic challenges. Many new nations were forced to choose sides in the Cold War, leading to internal divisions, authoritarian governments, and anarchy. But a coalition of poor African and Asian states sought to avoid this fate. They banded together to gain more influence in global affairs. When leaders of the non-aligned movement met in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, they represented 2/3 of the world's population.
It is a new departure in the history of the world that leaders of Asian and African peoples can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern.
Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, represented the rising tide of Arab nationalism in the Middle East. He described his form of government as moderate socialism, explaining it as socialism without capitalists, without imperialists, and without communists. But Nasser and other shrewd leaders played the two superpowers against each other to gain military and economic aid. American leaders suspected that many non-allied nations were under communist influence and tried to change their governments. In 1953, the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, became the target of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency's first regime change action. The CIA engineered a coup to get rid of Mossadegh, and then vested power in the Shah of Iran. The Shah became a staunch ally of the West. By the time U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Iran in 1972, most Iranians resented the Shah's repressive government and America's growing influence in the Middle East. But the success of the Iranian coup had been intoxicating and gave rise to many similar operations designed to eliminate potential threats and shape the politics of the Third World.
So as you finish this chapter, first of all, you have a section on the Vietnam War that will be rolled into your next test as we do a deep dive into that war, especially during the 1960s, during the Kennedy, but especially the Johnson and Nixon presidencies. What I want to highlight for you, though, is this terminology, because when you take a look at what Russia and the United States are doing, it's not something new. It's an extension of what you saw previously. And so throughout the time period you've been studying this course, you've been learning about colonialism, the idea that Europeans had of taking over territories so they would be able to extend military influence, economic influence, and you saw that then carrying through the late 1800s from what we called imperialism. So right now what you see is America battling over spreading democracy and capitalism to other parts of the world, while the Russians are spreading communism. But what you also heard is that with the Russians, they're also enabling socialist governments in their Soviet sphere that is on their team. And for the United States, you're about to see them engage in behaviors where they're going to be working with alliances with governments that are definitely not dictatorships, but they will provide aid for the United States. When we take a look at examples of that then, and you take a look at what happened within Egypt, notice the terminology they're using. So Americans are trying to protect democracy and capitalism in a Cold War against communism, but both the Russians and the United States are behaving imperialistically, where they're trying to figure out ways to expand their influence around the world, especially in protection of this colonialism that you saw previously. For other countries, though, they also want to have independence. And if you remember one of the terms we've learned in our class when we did our World War I game, we learned about nationalism, the idea of pride in one's countries, and very much a desire for independence and liberty from outside influence. So what I'd like to highlight for you is where we see that especially taking off after the Truman presidency. When Truman is president, he's got his Truman Doctrine, where he is promising to protect countries from undue influence from outside insurrections. When we get into the Eisenhower presidency, he's going to carry that on with the New Look, and he's going to start focusing on building nuclear bombs for massive retaliation because you don't need to feed them or clothe them. They're cheaper to maintain. But also they're a pretty heavy hammer where he's going to discover, he makes promises to Eastern Europe that he's going to come and protect them if they have revolutions. And then you saw with Hungary, Poland, and East Germany, he just can't do it. And so one of the things you should be understanding is as you watch presidential campaigns, Republicans and Democrats will oftentimes overpromise what they'll be able to deliver once they become president. The other idea with the Eisenhower presidency, though, is he's going to put into place something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And what I'd like to highlight for you is this is the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, where during World War I, down into this area was controlled by what was called the Ottoman Empire. You're going to hear a lot more about them when you take world history next year. They are very much the remnants of the Ottoman Empire that was in existence previously, and this empire was used to being a major governmental force up until the time of World War I, when they were then conquered and then subdivided. And in the Middle East, this area was divided up into French zones, into British zones, and especially during the time of World War I, with the development of the internal combustion engine, the discovery of oil in this region is going to make it highly desirable. You've now read inside your textbook about how Joseph Stalin moved into the area of Iran at the end of World War II and was reluctant to move until he was forced out by the Truman presidency, who was willing to put force on them. We're going to see in this area a lot of the lines that are drawn are not drawn with natural boundaries in mind, but instead they're drawn by colonial powers of England and France to designate areas that are under their control. And then once they gain their independence, we're going to see a battle taking place. These countries would like to be nationalistic, where they take care of their independence and they're able to generate wealth for themselves. But they're in a global tug of war between the Russians and the United States to see who can control them, and especially who can control their access to oil. So at this point, we should notice the Eisenhower Doctrine where the Eisenhower Doctrine is the idea that we are going to protect our interests in Middle Eastern oil to the point where we will step in if we feel like our interests are threatened to our access of oil inside these countries. Now, what's interesting about the Eisenhower Doctrine is this oil isn't ours, but we're putting a claim on it, even though it belongs to other countries. And so what you will see is we'll step in an instance like we saw in Egypt, where we'll see France and England and Israel and Russia trying to influence this area, and America is going to try to step in to keep the status quo because the stability of this area is prime for them. The insertion of Israel into this area is meant to create an alliance with a group of people who are sympathetic to the United States and our interests in the Middle East. And what you just saw take place is we just staged a coup in Iran where America's CIA went in while claiming that we like democracy and freedom. We undermined a democratic election in that country because Mossadegh, the leader of that country, wasn't just negotiating with the United States. They were also negotiating with Russia to see who would give them the best deal for their oil. In our sense, that would be capitalism, but when it comes to geopolitics, that's going to be unacceptable where we're in a win or lose battle against the Russians. So we depose the leader of Iran, kick him out, and we put into place not a democratic leader, but a dictator who is going to be known as the Shah of Iran. And our placement of this guy in Iran will give us access to cheap oil for the better part of 30 years. For the better part of 20 years. But then when he is toppled, he'll be replaced by a fundamentalist Muslim country that very much hates the United States right now for the influence that they had for that time and the amount of oil that they were able to withdraw to benefit the United States. And so this is going to become a very complicated situation because what we do during the period of the 20th century, which made sense during the Cold War, has now left in its wake a bunch of different feelings inside these countries, all of which would like to be nationalistic. Some of them would like to go directions nowadays that are not in the interests of the United States. And for the United States, we would still love to maintain stability here because while we've had some efforts to pursue other sorts of energy sources and we've gone with fracking, we are still heavily invested in the use of oil, and we are still heavily invested in drawing that out of the Middle East. So we're going to see a very interventionist behavior, which will drag us into conflicts in places like Cuba, Vietnam, and other places in your next unit. But that is the end of the material that we'll be expecting to be able to test on Monday. Again, please make sure to fill out any questions you guys have for your Sunday night review sessions. It starts at 7 o'clock. Have a good time this weekend. I hope you have a chance to relax outside of the studying that you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday. Have a great day.